And so our organization is called Alternatives to the Death Penalty. So we have tried to get a repeal bill, a full repeal bill, the last 3 years, unsuccessfully. Also with the SMI bill this year, we were unsuccessful. But we want to bring up an alternative to a full repeal. So we're thinking that, you know, the good people of South Dakota and the legislators would not want to execute someone that is severely mentally ill, especially if they're psychotic at the time of the crime. So that's kind of the purpose of this conference. I've invited several guest speakers to come in. Well, Scott finally made it, and I'm so happy that he did. He came all the way from New York, and he's been to airport, to airport, to airline, to airline, and I'm so grateful that he decided to come. Scott, welcome. Let's give him a South Dakota welcome.
Thank you, Denny, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's an honor to share the stage with Paula and Nami and all these other important people who do this important work when it comes to our criminal justice system and interfacing with mental health and mental illness issues. Because it's mental health, mental illness world is not one of the hats I wear. Denny just read a whole list of different things I do, and I do a lot of different things when it comes to death penalty, but you know, this is a specific area that's not my area of expertise. I really have a lot of high regard for people that do that work for them. It's really difficult, and it's a really emotional, challenging issue to be involved in. So the hat that I do wear that I'm here to talk to you about is my hat as the death penalty photojournalist. And I say that as a person who is doing this work as kind of on my own accord. My work around the death penalty is a self-directed project. It's independent. It's something that I came up with and that I continue working on because I see myself in the death penalty world as kind of the documentarian. I kind of saw this need for people to be documenting what's going on and providing images to the organizations that are working on death penalty stuff, so they have high quality images for their newsletters, their websites, their publications, their reports, all that stuff. So I kind of, since I'm not speaking as someone who has a family member on death row, I don't have a close family member who's been murdered. I'm a little kind of distant from being intimately involved. But this was kind of something that I saw in myself as a way to contribute to this movement to reduce and end execution. So what I wanted to do here today was talk about my role as the photographer. And as Denny said, I have a presentation that pairs stories and a narrative with photos. And so that's what I'm here to do today. I wanted to start out by giving a little background about how I came to this. I said that I saw kind of this opportunity for me to be involved in this way, but actually kind of goes back kind of to some specific life experiences that brought me to want to do this. And it really for me started, it's kind of hard to pinpoint when it happened, but when I went to college, I grew up in Texas. I was born and raised there, went to college there, grew up in Fort Worth, went to college in Dallas, and I studied sociology at the university I attended in Dallas. And just by default, the classes I took as a sociology major were largely focused on criminal justice issues just by the nature of our faculty. So I was taking classes about crime and punishment, correctional systems, all sorts of criminal delinquency kind of stuff. So I had a pretty solid academic grasp about the death penalty through my sociological training, but nothing ever really sparked me to have a personal opinion about what I was studying. It was very academic, very dry, based on theories and facts, which were all interesting and things like that. But what happened that really kind of moved me from a place of an academic experience of the death penalty and to the more emotional involved one was that my senior year, my last semester of my senior year, I took a history class called Human Rights and the American Dilemma. And in this class, we went through the whole gamut of the United States' involvement with human rights atrocities. Like we started at the very beginning of the founding of this country with the genocide of Native Americans and just traced that lineage of what our government has perpetuated in terms of violence against people, Native peoples of this land, and through all sorts of things. We talk about international slave trade, we talk about civil rights, human rights issues, through all the various wars that our country has been involved with, and talking about the United States' role or neglect in addressing human rights issues throughout time. And the class was a heavy class, and we had to read these huge, like once a week we had to read these like huge tomes of human rights doctrine and of international treaties and laws, and it was really intense. But there was a section in that class that talked about the death penalty, and that really spoke to me because, as I said, I was a student in Texas, and this was in 1999, and that was the peak of executions in this country. That year we executed 98 people in this country in 1999. That was the highest we ever saw. In Texas, we were executing one person a week. So this was a common occurrence that I was seeing unfolding in the media around me. And so to kind of have this human rights perspective on it really changed how I felt. But what really caused me to dig into this, especially as a photographer, was that as part of this human rights class I took, we were told at the very beginning that we were going to have to do an art assignment to turn in at the end of the semester. And the professor said, I just want you to pick any of the human rights topics we're talking about here in class, and I want you to pick any art form, and I want you to bring those two together and do a presentation for the class. And he said the art form can be anything you want, because everyone has different skills. It's like, you know, if you do collages, make a collage. If you're a sculptor, make a sculpture. Some people did quilting in the past. Some people painted. He's like, whatever you can do that. He said if you don't have any talent, you can just make like a mixed CD or a playlist of human rights music and turn that in, that'll count. He said the only thing he couldn't do actually was dance, because he said as a history professor, he would have no idea how to even begin grading someone dancing in front of the class. And I wasn't about to start dancing with my classmates, so that was a no-brainer. But what did speak to me was photography as an art form, because at the time I was the photo editor for my campus newspaper, took photos for the college yearbook. I fell in love with photography while I was in school. It wasn't my major, it was an accidental love that spoke to me. And so when he told us this, I was like, oh, photography is my thing, but how the heck am I going to do a photography project about human rights issues, about, you know, World War II or genocide? Like, well, how does that interface? And then all of a sudden it dawned on me. It's like, I live here in Texas. There are executions happening once a week, and I am going to school 4 hours away from the execution facility in Huntsville. And so what I did was I skipped all my classes on a Thursday afternoon, got my car and drove 4 hours down to Huntsville, Texas on the night of execution. I brought my camera, and I wanted to just capture whatever it was that was happening outside of the prison. And I had no idea what that would be. I did no research in advance of this. I'd never been to an execution vigil. Actually, I'd never been to a protest in my whole life. This is Texas, right? George Bush had just announced he was running for president as the governor. You know, there wasn't like this active political climate going on of progressive activism. So I didn't know what to expect. And so I just went down there with my camera to take pictures of what was going on with no expectations. Executions happen at 6 o'clock in the evening in Texas. And I went down about an hour before that. And when I got there, I was struck by a number of things and took photos of those. And one thing that I was struck by was how few people were there. I was standing outside of this monolithic prison where an execution was about to happen, and there were 6 people probably gathered for this vigil. And that kind of surprised me, because literally 2 blocks away was a major state university with a criminal justice program, and the university has 10,000 students, and yet there were 6 people there. One was a professor from the university, bless him for doing that, and he goes to every execution. And 3 of the people were these tourists, I think from Ireland, who just happened to be passing through, and Texas was in the news about the death penalty because of George Bush and the rate of executions. And so I was kind of struck by how few people were there. And that was one of the first pictures I took. And this is just those handful of people standing on the street corner across from the prison, and you see the prison there in the background. And so I was just kind of snapping pictures of what was going on, you know, nothing too dramatic. You can kind of see in the background where there's the car over the right shoulder of the person on the right. There's a little yellow police tape that the police put across just to make sure the protesters don't get too close to the prison. So it's kind of like this charade going on, the police tape going up and protesters being told to stand away from the building. It was very low key. But I was standing there just kind of surveying the space and checking things out. And I looked up at that brick building, and I saw something that struck me, and I took a photo of it. I saw a cross on top of the Texas Death House. And I grew up very involved in the church. My mom was an ordained Methodist minister, and when I saw that cross, I was just struck by the irony on so many levels. One of them being just separation of church and state, but also the cross being in Christian symbolism, the way we used to execute prisoners. This is how executions happened. And so here you have this archaic symbol of execution on top of the modern day death house. And so I took that just kind of like, it was just kind of like ironic commentary piece, an art form. And this was one of the photos I turned into the class. And I got an A on the art project, by the way, which I really needed. This class was really hard. And so I presented that photo to the class and kind of talked about things. So as I was doing this, something else transpired for me. I kind of went around, before they put up that police tape, I kind of went around to get a picture of the building and the clock and open these doors, just kind of document a little bit more what's happening in the prison. And I later found out as the evening progressed, what happens is that to my back as I'm taking this photo, there's a separate building, and that's where the witnesses of the execution gather. And as the execution nears and the state is confident that's going forward, the execution witnesses leave the building that's behind my back in the photo, and they walk across the street, go up that ramp or the stairs, and they go through those double doors into the building, and then they're taken to the witness room to witness the execution. That's part of this kind of charade thing that's happening outside the prison. So I took a picture before any of that was happening here at the prison, but I was struck by that clock up there, because as I was there that day taking pictures, I watched that clock. There was so little going on. I just kind of meditated on that clock, because you could watch that minute hand get closer and closer to 6, which is the time of execution in Texas. And I stood there just watching that clock and kind of meditating on all this I'd learned in my school, the academic perspective on the death penalty, the human rights perspective on the death penalty. And then when that clock struck 6, everything changed for me. Because all of a sudden it became this tangible emotional experience where I realized that literally across the street from where I stood, someone was dying. Someone was being murdered. Someone was being killed. And to look at it from that perspective, not just a sociological theory or a criminal justice, punishment that's handed down by juries or judges, also became this real raw thing of human life was ending across the street. And I imagined in any other scenario, if I knew someone was going to die in the hall across from where we were standing, I would do everything in my power to stop that. I would leave this immediately, dart down the hall, do what I could to stop someone from being killed. But here we were with this police tape and these monstrous brick walls and barbed wire fencing that prevented me from doing anything. I just had to stand there silently, helplessly on that street corner. And that's when I really realized that the death penalty is about human life. It's about real people who are affected by this system. And that had a profound impact on me in this kind of weird way. And I left that experience really kind of mulling the death penalty more personally. And what happened was that after I graduated, I stayed in touch with that professor. He was actually, it turns out he was very involved with Amnesty International, and he put me in touch with some Amnesty International people to get more involved. And I left I left college and stayed in the area, and at one point he reached out to me. He said, Scott, there's another execution coming up that I thought you might be interested in knowing about because I know you want to get involved. It's about a man named Larry Robeson. Has anyone here heard the name Larry Robeson before? So Larry Robeson, it turned out he's from my hometown, Fort Worth, and he was a man that had been diagnosed with severe paranoid schizophrenia at the age of 21. And he had a lot of mental health problems, and his mother had repeatedly tried to get help through the state and through the county hospitals to get mental health treatment for Larry. And he was admitted multiple times, and he would have 1 month in the hospital, and then they would release him. And she knew that he wasn't right, and she was worried about him. She kept going back to the state and the county saying, I need you to help my son. He's not well. I'm worried about him. And each time the state said, we can only keep him because our budgets are cut, the beds are short. And also, because Larry has no history of violence, there's little we can do. If he had a history of violence, we could treat him more here in Fort Worth. But he has no history of violence, so they kept letting him out. And what happened was that Larry, his first act of violence was that he murdered 5 people in his neighborhood. And the state stopped the death penalty against Larry, and he was convicted of the death penalty, despite his well-documented history of severe mental illness. And as I learned about this, I felt that was the moment for me when it spoke to me that executing mentally ill, I had already kind of come to the decision, executing anyone was just ridiculous and wrong, but to execute someone with that kind of mental illness, when the family intentionally tried to get mental health assistance from the state or the county, that to me was just completely unacceptable. And so what happened after learning about this case, I decided to drive those 4 hours back to Huntsville, Texas on the night of Larry's execution. And I didn't bring my camera with me. I just went because I wanted for the first time to stand publicly as someone against the death penalty. I wanted to stand there and say the death penalty is wrong. I want to hold the candle. I want to hold the sign. And I want to say that executing anybody, especially Larry, is completely wrong. And so I drove down there, went to do that, and arrived at the prison about an hour before the execution, which again is 6 o'clock. And I stood there, and again I meditated on that clock at the prison. And something completely different happened this time than it had happened the first time. Because as we stood there on that street corner, waiting for the execution, watching the charade of the police tape going up and the witnesses going from the building, one building into the next, what happened was that Larry's parents, when leaving that witness room, came and joined us on the sidewalk to stand with us. They said we cannot be inside that prison, to sit in that room and watch the state of Texas take our mentally ill son's life when we try to so desperately help. And we cannot do that. And so they stood there on the sidewalk, just within 10 feet from me. And as I stood there and we all were meditating on this clock and watching that minute and get closer and closer to 6, then something that will forever be etched in my mind happened, was that I just stood there and watched a mother at the moment of her son's execution, crying, just wailing, there on the street amidst this group of people. And for me, that put a face on the death penalty that I will never forget. And as I said, I didn't bring my camera that day. I wasn't there as with this idea on the document the death penalty or do anything special with my life related to this issue. I was there as a protester. But there was an AP photographer who took a picture that night. And this is the picture that was in the newspapers the next day in Texas. This is a picture of Larry that was taken while he was on death row, and that's his mother, Lois. And this is at that moment of his execution. And it's hard to see, but there are tears streaming down her face, and she's holding the sign. She just put herself publicly on the street to be that image of a mother who is losing her son. And to me, as I said, that was just life-changing. And at that point forward, I knew that I needed to do more. I needed to do something about the death penalty because I never wanted to watch this happen again. It was horrifying. I'm a sensitive person. I don't watch horror movies. You know, I really kind of distance myself from this kind of like graphic violence in the world. But to sit there and watch that was so hard. And it really solidified in me a calling to do something. And so from that point forward, I vowed, I was like, I am never coming to anything like this again without my camera. Luckily, there was the media there that took this picture that hopefully changed other people's hearts and minds. But with that first execution I went to, and many, many more executions after that, there are no media there. This picture is never seen. And so I took it upon myself to make sure those images are not lost, and that these stories can be told. And that was, for me, a real transformative moment. And it's led me to the involvement of, as Denny read out, in a lot of different organizations. One of them is working with murder victim family members. And I just chose this. I usually don't show this photo, but I participated in a conference on mental illness and the death penalty in Texas. There's an organization that started their program trying to bring families together who have loved ones with mental illness who have been executed in Texas. There's so many of them. There's an organization, actually, of people across the country through an organization called Murder Victims Families for Human Rights. So I've been a part of kind of their work and providing photos for their literature and their reports and campaigns. So it's been a journey of contributing in whatever way that I can. And kind of in the course of this work, I discovered this quote by Albert Camus, which for me is kind of like my mission statement that I've taken on in terms of how these photos can be used to change minds. And in case you can't read it, it says, "It would become harder to execute men one after another, as is done in our country today, if those executions were translated into vivid images in the popular imagination." And to me, that's really what my work is about, is that I think it can change hearts and minds. Photos historically have had a huge power of changing people's minds, of understanding war and all the atrocities that are so hidden from us in foreign lands. We can bring them home to our newspapers, our desktops, our phones, and we can experience that in a way that can change the way we view we do things. So I kind of use that as my mantra in a way about the death penalty. So that's all a little bit kind of a long introduction to what I wanted to do, which is to show you the photos I've taken on this journey. Starting, from that beginning of that, vigil as a college student in Texas up until the present moment. I've been documenting whatever I can for a number of years. And what I've done is I put the photos together in a narrative that tells the story. So what I'm going to do is go through a slideshow of photos. I'm going to be off to the side. I'm a photographer. I don't like to be in front of the camera. That's why I'm a photographer. So I'm going to stand over here, and I'm going to read to you a narrative to describe what's happening in the photos, to tell the story. And these photos tell a true story. I am showing you photos. Every single photo I've taken, every single photo was taken in the context of an execution or something with the death penalty. But they cover literally multiple decades. They cover multiple states, multiple cases. But I'm going to present it kind of in this cohesive one story form. So I'm not trying to deceive you that all these photos are from one day or one night and from one place or one person. This is literally covering from 1999 until April of this year, which is the last time I added some photos to this presentation. So I'm going to do that and walk you through what's happening in the photos and tell the story. And I've decided to present the story based on the narrative of one particular prisoner, the name of Troy Davis. Troy Davis was a man who there was no issues of mental illness in his case, but there was strong issues of innocence. Troy Davis was largely considered an innocent person who was ultimately executed by the state of Georgia 6 years ago in September of 2011. And I'm going to use the name of Troy Davis and some of the pictures of his family to tell the story, but I'm incorporating other photos, as I said, from other cases and other people. But just a little more background on Troy, just so you can grasp the severity of his case as I'm going through these photos. Troy Davis was a black man. He was convicted of murdering a white police officer. There was no physical evidence that tied Troy Davis to the crime. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapon. There were witnesses who said they claimed that Troy Davis was the perpetrator of the crime. The state of Georgia called 9 witnesses to Troy Davis's trial, and they all pointed to Troy Davis as the killer, and he was convicted only because of those 9 testimonies at his trial. After a long campaign of trying to bring attention to his case, which was led by his sister, because she was a volunteer with the Amnesty International, a worldwide campaign blossomed about the case of Troy Davis, because people, legal experts, experts in all sorts of fields, really believe that Troy Davis was innocent. And through research and investigation from his legal team, they actually got 7 out of those 9 witnesses to recant their testimony. 7 out of 9 witnesses said, we lied. We just flat out lied. They risked a lot by saying that, because that is a criminal offense. But 7 out of 9 said, we lied. We don't know who committed the murder. We were told by the police to say that. Some of them claimed that they were actually physically coerced to sign statements claiming they knew it was Troy Davis. A murder of a white police officer in the South brings a lot of heavy weight to how that crime is viewed. And there was so much pressure to convict someone. And Troy Davis was that scapegoat. 7 out of 9 witnesses recanted their testimony, and that was enough to spark this campaign to say we have their own person. And I will point out, one of those people that did not recant their testimony is the person that the other 7 pointed their finger at and said it was actually him. And so, of course, he's not recanting his testimony because he's the person who did it. And this is all spelled out in a wonderful book called I Am Troy Davis. It's co-written by his sister, who led this campaign, and a wonderful author, activist, and it features a lot of my photos around his case. And the book is called I Am Troy Davis. You should check that out to learn more about his case. It's mind-boggling how this happened in Georgia. But as we heard, Georgia with the pardons and parole systems and how they view all sorts of things, including mental illness and innocence, they don't really care about this stuff, unfortunately. Another long intro to the photo presentation. I think we have some time to do it all, so we can move in that direction. As with every story about the death penalty, it starts with a victim. For a state to give the death penalty, it requires a first-degree murder, and when there's a murder, there's a grieving family left behind. In the case of 27-year-old Officer Mark Allen McPhail, who was supposedly killed by Troy Davis, he left behind not only a wife, but a 1-year-old daughter, Madison, and an infant son, Mark Jr. Here are those children, now grown up nearly 21 years later after his murder, at a vigil for fallen police officers in Savannah, Georgia, comforting each other as they remember their father. Their story and the story of their family and the stories of more than 16 other families who experience murder in this country each year is a significantly important story to hear and understand. Violence and homicide is an epidemic that affects an untold tens of thousands each year in the United States. But I'm not here to tell that story. I'm here to tell the story that begins at the end of the road in this long process after homicide, where the perpetrator has been given the death penalty. I say the end of the road because an execution and the death penalty process, for that matter, is the very end of a long and tragic tale. To truly talk about crime and punishment, I have learned we have to talk about the whole story, why people are committing murder in the first place. We have to back up to that moment that led a person to pick up a gun and enter a convenience store, a home, or a school. It means we have to talk about poverty, we have to talk about drug and alcohol addiction, we have to talk about mental illness, we have to talk about racial profiling, the use of police forces, gun possession, gangs, violence in our schools, broken families, PTSD, and just the culture of violence that permeates everything in our society. We have to talk about so much before we even get to an execution. But I'm here to focus on that final chapter, because that is the story my photos tell. Here is where the part of the death penalty story starts. A prisoner who has been given the death penalty for murder spends their time on their state's death row. After a number of legal appeals are filed in the courts and eventually denied, a death warrant will be issued and an execution date set. This process may take as many as 10 to 15 years or more. While on death row, prisoners are confined to 15 by 7-foot prison cells for as many as 23 hours a day with little or no outside recreation time. The narrow slits of window at the top of their cells are the only glimpse into the outside world often. On the other side of the prison compound is the state's execution facility, also called the death house. Inside of the death house is the execution chamber. Here, the execution chamber is on the second floor of this building, in the area where there are no windows. It is in this place that a prisoner will be brought for execution when the time comes. A few days prior to the execution, the prisoner will be transferred from death row to a special area called Deathwatch. It is called Deathwatch because the prisoner is under constant supervision to make sure that they do not commit suicide before they are taken out and killed by prison officials. While on Deathwatch, these final days are broken up with periodic visits by family, friends, and attorneys. For all the years on death row, visits always took place where the prisoner is separated from the family by thick glass. However, on the very day of execution, the family and friends will be allowed to hug and touch the prisoner for the first time since their initial arrest, which may have been, as I said, 10, 15, or even 20 years ago. This final physical contact visit may last up to 4 hours. Then the family and friends will not be allowed to see the prisoner again until the time of execution, if it is even allowed by the warden of the prison. After visitation ends, family and friends and attorneys wait in a nearby fast food restaurant by the prison. They sit and wait, hoping for news of clemency from the governor or a stay of execution from a high court. At this very same time, the prisoner will sit here for their final meal, a meal that often includes anything they want to eat within reason. Some prisoners order a feast, some choose to fast, and some mentally ill prisoners, as we have learned, have asked to save their leftovers to eat later. After the final meal, the prisoner is allowed to make a few final phone calls to family under close supervision by a guard in the nearby monitoring booth. On the other end of the phone, families say goodbye. Here, Troy Davis's mother, Virginia, retreats to the far corner of the nearby restaurant to speak with her son. A heartbreaking final farewell that echoed in the stillness of the heavy moment. Troy's mom then gathers on the prison grounds to stand witness against her son's execution, surrounded by comforting friends and supporters. As per Georgia's prison policy, family are not allowed to witness the execution and must stay outside. In 90 minutes from this moment, the execution was to be carried out. I say was in the past tense because at that very moment, word arrives to the gathered crowd that the U.S. Supreme Court has stayed the execution. The execution would not happen today, nor would it happen until the new evidence of Troy's innocence could be heard in a court of law. Troy's sister, Martina, at the far right, wipes away tears of relief, while Reverend Al Sharpton in the center, who is Troy's spiritual advisor, beams a smile directly at Troy's mother. It was victory. The day ends with a prayer circle to give thanks for the courts doing the right thing, and with hope that Troy would soon be freed when the evidence was heard. So Troy returns to his bed on death row, and he waits. After 2 years of waiting, Troy finally has his day in court. Troy's family and supporters, including presidents of the NAACP and Amnesty International, approach the Savannah courthouse to attend the court hearing. A hearing to bring to light the fact Georgia had convicted the wrong person and give a chance for those 7 recanted testimonies to appear before a judge for the first time. The world's attention turned to the plight of Troy Davis after his near-miss execution that was stayed only 90 minutes before carrying out. The media was swarming events like the hearing in Savannah. With the efforts of Troy Davis, backed by Amnesty International and NAACP, the world was paying attention. Over the course of these few years, over 1 million people, including well-known politicians, judges, government figureheads, including the head of the FBI, all signed petitions calling on the state of Georgia to spare an innocent man's life. But a year later, the judge in the case decided the evidence wasn't enough to stop the execution. A new death warrant was issued. The news shocked the world, and it shocked the family. Troy's mother, Virginia, in otherwise perfectly good health, died suddenly. The stress and emotional roller coaster was too much for her to handle. Execution day. Amnesty International's executive director pauses to collect himself in the foyer of a church across from the prison where Troy is scheduled to be put to death at 7 p.m. that evening. Rallies and protests were held everywhere, from state houses in the U.S. to embassies abroad. Thousands of people had marched in the streets of Atlanta and all across the world in the days leading up to the execution date. The consensus was that an innocent man was once again about to be executed. Press conferences were held to encourage the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles, the Georgia governor, and even the President of the United States to step in and stop it, but no one did. At 4 p.m., in a final press conference at the church across from the prison, Troy's family gathered to make a final plea for their brothers, their uncles, their family members' life. Troy's outspoken sister, Martina, who had been recently hospitalized from her battle with breast cancer, rose to her feet out of her wheelchair during the press conference and said, "I stand here today to tell you, I am Troy Davis. You are Troy Davis. We are Troy Davis." Across the street at the prison, people began to gather and protest. Buses of people from all over Georgia were arriving, carrying signs, banners, and hopeful energy that once again there would be a stay. At the last execution date, there were perhaps 50 people there in protest. This time, there were far more. Some media reports said as many as 1,000 people. Armed police officers' teams worked to intimidate the crowds, telling people that they couldn't be there, threatening peaceful protesters with guns and with arrest. Eventually, due to the vast numbers of people descending on the area, the police relent and allow for protesters to stand along the highway across from the prison. About 50 people were allowed on the prison grounds themselves, but the rest were behind yellow police tape and guarded heavily. SWAT team members and several other law enforcement agencies showed full force to prevent any disruption of the execution. In acts of civil disobedience and resistance, some protesters crossed the yellow police tape into the street, only to be thrown to the ground and arrested immediately. A scene not unique to this particular execution. In states like Texas and North Carolina, people have been arrested for acts of civil disobedience. Others engage in other creative forms of protest, highlighting issues such as racial disparities in the criminal justice system. In rare cases, some even take up arms and fight against the death penalty, militantly taking to the streets. Of course, not everyone outside the prison is against what is happening on the inside. Here at Troy Davis's execution, 2 people gathered to support Troy's killing. Some come out to support the executions, citing Christian principles of the Old Testament. And some come to argue that people who commit murder deserve what they have coming to them. Back inside the prison, about 3 hours before the time of the 7 p.m. execution, the prison warden supervises the transportation of the prisoner to the Deathwatch area, from the Deathwatch area into a preparation room. Here, the prisoners stripped down to their underwear, and arms, legs, and chest are strapped to the gurney. Then a single white sheet is laid over the body. The warden takes the statement from the prisoner, which will be transcribed and released later to the media. After the last statement, the chaplain is brought in to be with the prisoner until it is time to be taken into the death chamber. Prison staff began moving witnesses from a waiting area toward the execution chamber. Witnesses of the execution are brought into the viewing room 10 minutes before 7 o'clock. The room is able to hold 2 rows of 4 chairs each. It is in this small space that the victim's family, the prisoner's family, the media, attorneys, prison staff, and police will all witness. On average, there are 16 people. So with just 8 chairs, many will stand along the walls, shoulder to shoulder. At this time, the warden instructs the witnesses that everyone must act in a professional manner. There will be no talking, no crying, no outbursts, or any other sign of emotion during the carrying out of the death sentence, which will be viewed closely through the window straight ahead. After the final visit with the prison chaplain, with 5 minutes to go, the gurney is wheeled from the prep room into the adjacent death chamber. The gurney and the prisoner are placed at the viewing window, eye level with the witnesses on the other side of the double-pane window and soundproof walls. And then prison staff wait for that final phone call to give them the go-ahead to start the execution. While it varies from state to state, sometimes the prisoner family are not allowed to or choose not to witness the execution. Troy Davis's family was not allowed to, as per prison policy. Here, just 3 minutes before 7 o'clock, Troy Davis's nephew, Dejan, is surrounded by supporters on the prison grounds as he looks toward the sky, thinking of his uncle on the inside. A clock inside the death house strikes 7 o'clock p.m. At that very moment that Troy Davis is scheduled for execution, friends and supporters begin hugging each other, shedding tears and cries of sorrow and pain. Some collapse into the ground in screams of disbelief. Then suddenly at 7:01, it's announced that the U.S. Supreme Court has stopped the execution. A man reacts to the news while on live TV behind journalist Amy Goodman. Unbelievable excitement spreads throughout the crowd with a roar I've heard like none other, erupting from across the prison where thousands of voices fill the air. Those previous tears of sorrow turn into tears of joy. It is soon learned that the court has simply delayed the execution. They have not stayed it like last time 3 years earlier. People face the prison in prayer and silent meditation while waiting on news of what is to come. At 7:30, the sun sets over the crowd on the prison grounds while the thousands stay strong across the street. The glare of the television lights illuminate the area of the 50 protesters with live coverage in the historic moment. At 8:15, Troy's teenage nephew Dejan and his younger niece Kirsten play while other family members look on. As the hours pass, optimism is maintained, but still no word about Troy's fate. At 9 o'clock, there's still no new information, and on the outside, organizers lead those gathered in spiritual song and prayer. Then the news comes. At 10:20, in a waiting room of the prison, it is announced that the Supreme Court has lifted the delay. Attorneys react to the news, knowing that all hope is lost. The execution will go forward. Outside the prison, organizers and pastors, standing over Sister Martina and other family members, share the dire news from the inside. At 11:08, Troy's Sister Martina looks toward the prison, knowing that the execution is underway by this time. Gathered around her are friends and supporters as a quiet lull of disbelief permeates the area. Back inside the prison, once again, the warden wheels the prisoner in the gurney into the death chamber and places him at the viewing window. Once the prisoner is in place, a curtain is pulled to divide the death chamber into 2 parts. On one side is the prisoner and the witnesses in the viewing window. On the other side of this curtain is a 3-person execution team, hidden from the sight of the condemned and everyone else. Now this is the part that no one ever sees, not even the witnesses. But we know the following from a release report. Just before the prisoner was brought into the death chamber behind the curtain, back when he was strapped to a gurney in the preparation room, 2 IV catheters were started. one in each arm. Members of the I-team spent 24 minutes trying to get an IV into the prisoner's left arm. Ultimately unsuccessful, they try to set another line in the right arm. They spend 8 minutes on the right arm before going back to the left arm for one more attempt. That still doesn't work. So the IV team calls for the help of a doctor who is present to monitor the prisoner's vital signs during the execution. The doctor spends 13 minutes setting an IV near the groin, which execution protocol says is a last-minute result if lines in the arm are not possible. After 54 minutes of all of this, the injection system is finally set in place, and the prisoner is brought to the viewing window. At the signal of the warden, a series of 3 drugs are administered into the IV lines by the hidden execution team. The first puts the prisoner to sleep. The second is a paralyzing drug. The third and final dose is a deadly chemical that stops the heart. Sometimes the drugs work quickly, and the prisoner will simply close their eyes and drift away. At other times, there are prisoners with problems, and there will be thrashings and gasps. 17 minutes later, the doctor, monitoring an EKG machine from a nearby room, emerges to pronounce the prisoner dead. Outside the prison, family of the prisoner weep, comforting each other in this dark hour. Witnesses exit the prison to attend the press conference in the nearby waiting room. A representative of the prison announces the time of death and releases the prisoner's final statement. Then the body of the prisoner is loaded into a white coroner's van, which will go directly to a nearby hospital for examination and notice from the office of the chief medical examiner. At the hospital, a death certificate is issued. In section 21C, the prison doctor has indicated the manner of death as a homicide. Back at the prison, empty tissue boxes are left behind in the waiting room, and another body is laid to rest. While you may think that nights like this are rare because we aren't hearing about them on a regular basis in our news, it is all actually quite common. The story I've just shared currently happens about 2 or 3 times each month in this country. Until very recently, it was once a week. To date, there have been a total of 1,461 executions since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. There have been 19 executions so far this year, and there are 10 more scheduled, including one on Thursday of this coming week. And there will be more to come. There are nearly 3,000 people on death rows today across this country, including on federal and military death rows. The death penalty is, by all accounts, in decline. Less than half of the states have or use the death penalty, but it does still persist, and is still just as devastating to those who go through that timeline narrative each time an execution takes place, regardless of if the mainstream media is or is not there paying attention, and regardless if there are 6 or 600 people there to protest. So I want to back up and give you some deeper context to just a few of the photos that I just showed you, to touch on a couple important issues relevant to where the death penalty is today. When I ended my timeline narrative, I showed this photo. This is an actual gravesite of an executed prisoner in a Texas Department of Corrections cemetery. While a family member of an executed prisoner when a prisoner's family cannot afford to pay for a burial, the state of Texas offers this as the option. The stone cross grave marker indicates that an unclaimed prisoner body was buried on September 10th, 1999. The prisoner was number 999107. The X before the prisoner's number simply indicates that they were executed by the state. There's no name anywhere to be found. When it comes to the actual lethal injection process in this country, I said earlier that after the 3rd and final injection, the prisoner is pronounced dead 17 minutes later. This is increasingly not the case nor the norm. Often the fatal drug used has been potassium chloride, but since most pharmaceutical companies are now refusing to provide that drug for execution purposes, the prison may resort to using experimental drugs acquired from foreign labs and through illegal channels. These drugs are untested on humans and dangerously risky. Depending on which drug is used, it can take up to 2 hours before a prisoner is killed. In recent cases in Oklahoma, Arizona, and Ohio, It has been reported that prisoners appeared to be under great pain during the process. In some cases, executions have been halted midway because the drugs were not performing as expected, which has ignited a national conversation regarding the Eighth Amendment, which prevents cruel and unusual punishment. While lethal injection is the most common form of execution in this country, I do want to point out there are actually 5 methods of execution that are still legally allowed and have been used. Death by lethal injection is illegal in all 30 states that still have the death penalty on the books, and was last used just 2 days ago in the state of Florida. Death by hanging, as shown in this photo of someone's Halloween display in their yard, an effigy of a black man hanging, is still allowed in 3 states and was last used in Delaware in 1996. Death by gassing is still allowed in 5 states and was last used in Arizona in 1999. Death by electrocution is allowed in 8 states and was last used in Virginia in 2013. And then there's death by firing squad, which I have no photo to represent, but that's still allowed in 2 states and was used just 7 years ago in Utah. While some of these methods are increasingly uncommon, they are still legal and have happened in most of our lifetimes, and it's expanding. Tennessee added electrocution to its law, and Oklahoma added gassing and firing squad, all in preparation for the lack of drugs that are available to prisons nowadays. The photo I used here to represent the gas chamber was actually taken at a concentration camp in Germany. I mention this because we absolutely cannot talk about the death penalty without putting it into a human rights historical context. The technology, methodology, and protocol of carrying out lethal injections in the US and electrocutions is a direct product from the Nazi camps of Germany. Since that time, the world has overwhelmingly renounced the power of the state to kill human beings. In fact, using the death penalty is a violation of every major international treaty and law. Worldwide, 70% of all countries have abolished the death penalty in law or practice. On average, 2 more countries abandon executions each year, with Turkey, Mexico, Liberia, the Philippines, Rwanda, Argentina, Uzbekistan, and Chile joining recently. Last year was Kenya, the year before that, the Congo. The photo shows Amnesty International students in New York City protesting outside the Russian consulate, calling on Russia to end the death penalty. So many countries don't have the death penalty, so the question is, then who continues to execute prisoners? For the last few years, the United States has ranked 5th among all countries in the total executions carried out. Our only allies ranking top 4 are China, Iran, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. And on any other given year, you might see Sudan, Somalia, Iraq, Yemen, Korea, or Vietnam on that list. This is the company that we keep. In fact, we're the only Western democracy left in the world that retains the practice. In this photo taken in 2000, the KKK rallied in support of executing Gary Graham, a 17-year-old African-American offender in Texas, who allegedly killed a white man named Bobby Lambert. At trial, Graham had a nearly all-white jury and was given death, very much like Troy Davis, despite no murder weapon, no fingerprints, and in his case, 1 eyewitness who claimed she could identify him, even though she saw him from across the dark parking lot in the middle of the night. He pleaded his innocence all the way to his death as well. If there's anything that highlights issues around racism in the death penalty, white men in KKK gowns in the streets speaks for itself. And as a footnote, 5 years after Graham was executed, the U.S. Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional to execute juvenile offenders like Gary Graham, who were 17. But what has been done is done. There's no reversing an execution. And that is a huge problem, as we know for a fact that innocent people like Troy Davis have been executed for crimes they did not commit. Troy and Gary are not alone. Look up the names Carlos de Luna and Cameron Tom Willingham for others. And so many more have had disturbingly close calls. The following photos are just a handful of the 159 men and women who have been exonerated from death row of their actual innocence, part of a portrait project I've been doing. Some exonerees have spent more than 30 years awaiting their execution, sometimes having had come within hours of the actual process, only to be declared innocent and released. Human lives that were almost taken by the system because the government made a mistake or perhaps intentionally falsified a case against them. Which begs an important moral question. If these people had been executed wrongfully, would it still have been worth it in order to punish the truly guilty? In my work, I have spent a lot of time with some of these men. I've heard them tell their story day after day to audience after audience. While the stories themselves are hard to listen to and will bring anyone to a maddening anger at the system, what always hits me the hardest is when I see a grown man cry. Telling the story never gets easier for them. The wounds may never heal. The real tears are always the manifestations of genuine pain. This photo shows a tearful Kwame Ajamu being surrounded by other death row honorees after telling his story of being sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit and leaving behind in prison an innocent brother. I spent some time with Kwame last year on a tour throughout the state of Delaware, and every time I heard him speak, I witnessed tears streaming down his cheeks. It brings another side of the issue home, that is, the devastation of the innocent and their families. And as a photography side note, this particular image is one that I just added to my presentation recently. I'm still trying to figure out how to process it and work it into this. This is Kwame, a black Muslim man, speaking in a white Christian church, flanked on one side by the cross, a symbol of execution of the innocent Jesus, and on the other, the flag of the United States, a symbol to many of racial injustice. I'll leave it to you to draw your own interpretations. I initially said I wasn't here to tell the story of the victims and the justice the victims and the families seek, but I do want to mention one particular person who had an impact on me, and this is Bud Welch. And here he holds a photo of his 24-year-old daughter, Julie, who was killed along with 167 others by Timothy McVeigh in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. Bud says that the term closure is a myth and nothing will end his pain and his anger, not even the execution of Timothy McVeigh. Bud campaigns internationally for an end to the death penalty, arguing that the false promise of closure from the state only causes families of victims to suffer more. Through the death penalty, the families are forced to relive their pain and loss every time the prisoner has a legal appeal, and then again when the person is executed, and the media rehashes the murder and the story of what happened. Their healing process drags on for decades, reset at every step of the way. Bud is not a minority voice. Hundreds of murder victim families travel the U.S. and around the world to call for compassion and forgiveness, not execution, in their name. Thousands more oppose the death penalty in their own ways. At the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., victims' families gather to speak out against the death penalty as part of an annual 4-day protest that Denny mentioned. Many travel around various states each year with an organization called Journey of Hope to share their stories and to seek an end to violence. They proclaim, as the banner behind them says, "We remember the victims, but not with more killing." And not only are the families of the victims grieving, but the families of those still on death row fight for their loved ones' lives. Here, gathered, are family of death row prisoners, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, weeping because they cannot hug and comfort those that they love so much. They seek support in a society that has demonized them too and wants to kill their family member. I showed this photo as part of the narrative earlier as well. This is the new Black Panther Party taking to the streets, armed with automatic weapons aimed into the crowd. Their cause was to protest against Gary Graham's execution, the same one where the KKK was. Graham was the 17-year-old African-American prisoner in Texas unconstitutionally executed in the year 2000. During this protest, the Panthers climbed on top of the car in downtown Huntsville and threatened to shoot any white media in retaliation if the state carried out the execution. I was at their feet when this was said, but you can imagine that I moved quickly. I took this photo on the way out from the back. You can see the other lone white woman on the far lower right corner looking over her shoulder for her exit too. The execution went forward, but thankfully those threats were empty. In that experience, however, I asked myself, what does the death penalty teach us? That killing is an appropriate response to killing? That retaliatory violence is an acceptable means of addressing conflict? It is clear that it's an endless cycle, regardless if it's the Panthers threatening it or our own criminal justice system. So what does this teach us as a society? And what does it teach our children who watch what goes on? In the crowd at Gary Graham's execution with the KKK on one side and the Black Panthers on the other, this young girl clenches her toy gun, observing the drama in the streets. But while the drama is rarely in the streets, it is carried out in the dead of night behind secure prison walls, while victims' families desperately seek closure. Prisoner families prepare for loss. and so that the rest of us can supposedly sleep safer at night. And that is the intersection of state and justice. That says these crossroads in Indiana, just down the road from the federal death row in Terre Haute, Indiana, in the hours before Timothy McVeigh's execution. I just want to go back to one last photo from Troy Davis's execution in the narrative, as this is the most powerful one for me personally. It wasn't until a day or two later, when I sat down to look through my photos carefully after that execution, that I really truly experienced the execution of Troy Davis. As a journalist, it's easy to focus on the job at hand and to not let it become a personal experience. At least that's what we're taught and trained in order to be unbiased journalists. When I was going through my photos, I stayed on this one image of Troy's outspoken sister, Martina, who I was close with, who was the reason that Troy Davis's case and his name was known around the world. In the image, Martina looks off in the distance toward the prison from her wheelchair. Martina had a long battle with breast cancer and was very sick due to various drugs that she was taking. Monica, the young woman to the right of Martina, holding the large poster, had just come over to meet Martina. Monica told Martina that she had driven all the way from San Francisco to Georgia alone to stand outside of the prison that night to bear witness against Troy's execution. Martina thanked her weakly and then called over Laura, who was Amnesty International's U.S. death penalty director, pictured on the far right, because she wanted Monica to get connected to the larger movement, to become involved in what was going on. The photo shows Monica and Laura exchanging contact info, and it shows Martina looking off in the direction of where her brother was, behind those prison walls, strapped to a gurney with drugs on their way to his heart. I meditated on this photo for a long while. I looked at the digital file info, which told me that the photo was taken at 11:08 p.m. I thought back to that night and knew that at that time the scene was unfolding. We were speculating that Troy was probably being killed inside the prison. We knew the Supreme Court had lifted the delay an hour earlier, and there was nothing left to stop the process. And while we were aware of all this, and stood or sat in this reality, Troy's sister Martina chose not to give up her tireless work. Even in her poor health and dire situation, she pressed on in that moment, still signing up college students to take action. She was acting not as the grieving family member, but the community organizer, the activist, steadfast. It was an image that spoke to the perseverance and absolute dedication of Martina, even in the face of this, in the face of what was being done unjustly to her innocent brother. As I was sitting there at my computer with this image a few days after the execution, I also was finally reading the media reports, including the information provided by the prison, such as the release of Troy's final statement, details of his last meal, a response from the victim's family, all the usual media fascinations. When I read the prisoner doctor's declared time of death, I shuddered. 11:08 p.m. The photo of Martina that I so connected with was taken not just when we thought the execution process was underway, but the exact minute that Troy Davis died. I immediately broke down into tears, and I wept for days. I may not have wept at 11:08 that night when Troy Davis died. I was busy being a photographer. Martina may not have wept at 11:08 that night when her brother was murdered. She was busy being that advocate, but we all wept later. When we could step outside of those roles that were the most critical for that point in time and place. And as a footnote to this story, 10 weeks after Troy's execution, Martina passed away, finally able to let go of her incredible campaign to save her brother's life. So, deep breath. It's always hard for me not to break down telling these stories. And honestly, I struggle with how to end my presentation because it's heavy, right? I mean, talking about all this is heavy. And I don't like to end on, I used to tell some jokes about something just to try and lighten the mood. I'm not really exactly know how to do that. But I think there's something that happened this year that I documented that I think we have a couple of minutes. Yeah, I think we have 4 whole minutes. So wanted to end by saying this past April I was in Arkansas for 2 weeks. Arkansas had 10 executions scheduled in 8 days. It was the quickest, fastest clearing of the death row that we'd ever seen in this country. And I was there on the ground to help organize and work on that and to take photos as part of the work around the executions in Arkansas. And those stories and photos I really haven't fully integrated into this, even though that was back in March. I'm still trying to process how that fits into the story. But in Arkansas, what happened was 4 of those 8 executions were stayed, thank God. But 4 of them did happen in Arkansas. And I was there to be present to those and to witness those. And those were all very dark, heavy moments. They very much remind me of Troy Davis. There was that back and forth of not knowing if it was going to happen, and when it was going to happen, and thinking it wasn't, and then it was. And it was an emotional roller coaster, beyond belief. But for that 4th and final execution that happened, an amazing thing happened that kind of ends on a positive note. And I wrote something that's a really long kind of thing that I posted online, but I'm just going to read it to you to talk about this one photo. And this is a photo I didn't plan on taking. I actually took it on a phone. I never take photos on phones. You can probably tell the quality difference between this photo and everything else I've done. But it was this moment that happened that I had to capture, and all I had was my phone. So I'm just going to read this little thing to close out. So I forgot to say those 8 executions that were scheduled in Arkansas over 10 days, they were 4 double executions. The state wanted to execute 2 people per night on 4 different days in a 10-day span. That final set of double executions on day 10 had already been reduced to 1, even before this all started. The state parole board announced in advance that it would recommend changing 1 prisoner's sentence to life in prison without parole, but 1 man still remained, Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams killed a man named Cecil Boren in 1999. During the law enforcement pursuit of Williams, he fled from police in a high-speed chase that also killed a truck driver named Michael Greenwood. Greenwood was a father with a 5-year-old Kayla at home and his wife Stacy, pregnant with twin boys. Just days before Williams' scheduled execution, the Greenwood family found out that Kenneth's 21-year-old daughter, Jasmine, had an online fundraising page so that she could travel from Seattle to Arkansas to visit her dad one last time before his execution. And also, hopefully, that she could bring her daughter, age 3, with her to meet her grandfather for the first time. The Greenwoods saw this, and Jasmine's plea resonated with the Greenwood family, especially with Kyla, who is now 22 and has 2 young boys of her own, who also have never met their maternal grandfather since he was murdered. Kaya and her family decided to pay for 2 plane tickets so that Jasmine and her daughter could fly to Arkansas the next day. Not only that, the Greenwood family drove from Missouri to the airport in Little Rock to pick them up themselves and drive them to the prison for that final visit. I learned all of this the day before the scheduled execution when my wife called me and asked if I heard about this story. I had not, so she read the original article to me over the phone. It brought tears to my eyes. To hear a story of not only forgiveness and compassion, but of a victim's family reaching out to the prisoner's family as a recognition that they were all in this tragedy and lost together was incredibly moving. I had the strongest urge to hug the Greenwood family as I heard this story and thank them for being a beacon of light in this dark period in the belly of the Arkansas beast. To me, it felt like that hope of a resurrection that I so desperately was searching for in Arkansas. And I say that because this was all happening the week after Easter. And miraculously, I got that chance. I was with my team in a Little Rock hotel having dinner with a reporter the night before Kenneth Williams' execution. We were actually not even supposed to be there. We had a big public event planned that night, but had to cancel it due to a tornado warning. And as we ate there, who walks in the restaurant but none other than the entire Greenwood family? Stacy and her twin boys, Kyla, and several other family members. Before dinner was over, I approached them, hands over my heart, to utter words of appreciation that just didn't quite seem enough. I asked questions about how they came to this place in their own hearts, and heard more about their perspective on forgiveness. It was absolutely humbling. I told them that if something so tragic ever happens to me or my family, I pray that we respond just as they have, with mercy and compassion. And if this hadn't been enough, as my team and I were leaving the hotel, in walks Jasmine and her daughter. And I witnessed the two families pitted against each other in the criminal justice system, hugging each other with tears in their eyes. Kyla, here in the photo, dropping to her knees to hug Jasmine's little daughter, who would never again meet her grandfather, just as Kyla would never again see her dad. And they held each other with smiles beaming through those tears. The night of the first execution in the series, when I met Jack Jones' sister, Lynn Scott, she was talking to a reporter from the local paper and describing her experience as a death row family member. She said her family and the victim's family are all feeling inverse feelings. She talked about how the criminal justice system sets it up so that the two sides are against each other, so that when one wins, the other loses. Without any forethought, she mentions a North Carolina amusement park that she goes to called Carowinds. And she says, quote, "There's this roller coaster there, one that goes forward and one that goes backwards. So you're passing the other person, and so you're going in different directions. That's what it is. Families on the same terrifying ride, moving in parallel, yet divergent courses." For all the stories and accounts of cruelty, injustice, and loss here in Arkansas, the Greenwoods and the other families involved in what transpired here brought up stories of hope, of reconciliation, of forgiveness, and of mercy. And they showed us that there is indeed a different way, and that we can choose to live in the light. No matter what everyone else says, no matter how dark the stormy skies may be, no matter how much the world sees us as crazy, and no matter how sickening that roller coaster ride may be. During the weekend of traveling around the state showing films and photos, we visited an Episcopal church that had an art display of death row prisoners, which was paired with the Stations of the Cross. It was a moving display of art from within prison walls. There was also an altar in the front of the room that had a display of 8 candles, one for each of the 8 men, each paired with a name on a card. At this point, one execution had been carried out, so the candle of Liddell Lee, the first prisoner executed, was extinguished. The other 7 candle flames flickered dimly. As I stood outside the governor's mansion, that fourth and final execution of Kenneth Williams, I held a candle, singing songs of solidarity for the Greenwood and the Williams families, as well as all of those I had met during those 10 days in Arkansas. When it was announced that the execution had concluded and Kenneth was dead, the 50 or so of us circled up for a closing, and then we each blew out our flickering flames. Another light extinguished, another prisoner gone on a gurney, and another set of victims mourning the loss of a loved one. As these candles of life shine and then are snuffed, we are surrounded by an unsettling darkness, but even in that dark place, we know there's a light underneath the surface. However faint and subtle it may be, it is there, warming us with hope. It may be the dark of night now, but the glimmer of tomorrow's sunrise is on the horizon. But didn't end as hopeful as I meant to, but there is tremendous hope in all this, and we are moving in a direction. What's going on here, with the conversations around mental illness is one of those stepping stones towards this broader future of hope. So I just want to thank you for listening. It's kind of like this cathartic, personal, experience to share all that. So I appreciate you listening to all that.